Questions, your comments or observations, please. Remember, like a classroom, feel free. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Professor Cochran.
We have microphones.
All right, thank you, Professor Cochran. So my question is, I can generalize this as, is it possible to have another Hu Shi in our time? So I was discussing this with my aunt one time, and she said it's kind of impossible because in Hu Shi's time, everything is unsettling, like things are changing, chaotic. So that is a time that needs new ideas. So Hu Shi came up with this very substantial idea and suddenly make him a celebrity. On the other hand, it is also easier to cross a border of scholars, so make a scholar into say, a foreign affair figure. So he came from the principal of Peking University to become ambassador in US, and which is also kind of impossible in China now because the bureaucratic system is kind of strict and more orthodox than that day. So the conclusion, so I thought, at that time, I thought it's probably impossible to have another Hu Shi who enjoys that kind of prominent status in contemporary China. So I'm just curious, what do you think? Thank you.
Yes, well, thanks for the question. There was one premise I thought you were postulating there about how it was chaotic and unsettled at that time, and I wouldn't assume it's never going to be chaotic and unsettled again. It could be, I think the fundamental point you're making is right on target, and that is that maybe greatness has to do with context. If we isolate a figure and characterize that figure as strictly within his own, on his own terms without reference to context, how can we evaluate greatness? I think this could be actually a criticism made of the entire lecture, that more context would be needed to appreciate what he did and what could be done similarly in the future. The part about his crossing borders from official writer to official to celebrity and so on, I think that's still happening in our own time. If anything, I think I would go the opposite direction. I would say that my distinction between, let's say, Pynchon as a high culture figure and Marinero as a popular culture figure is too sharp. I announced at the beginning today that Pynchon's movie is coming out. That sounds like popular culture to me. So maybe these borders are rather porous, and figures do move pretty readily in our own time across them. Whether a professor could be made ambassador from China to the United States today, I suppose that's not very likely, but I don't know that it's inconceivable. I can imagine a couple of candidates, if that feeds into your thinking about it. The question about whether Hu Shi is himself or his ideas are themselves relevant today, I think is politically charged. I can only offer you, based on conversation, not on systematic research, examples that I've been given of suggesting that Hu Shi is like a symbol of a body of thought in China that's antagonistic toward another body of thought in China today. Invoking his name sets off political disputes. And I think that's probably true. Maybe evidence of his revival, that old image keeps coming back. I think my basic answer to your question would go back to the quality of his prose. I think when people start reading Hu Shi again the way they once did, they're going to like it. He just writes, whether you agree with him or not, he writes very persuasively. And once those writings go around, he could be invoked in lots of conversations. Yes?
From the time that he was recalled as ambassador to the establishment of the communist regime, the republic, what was his role? What was going on? What was happening to him at that time?
Yeah, well, that is a kind of an odd period for him, especially after 1948. He ceased to be ambassador in 42 and went back to China, and then he had these offers of these high positions, vice president or president in 48. So those were possibilities. This was a very chaotic time in China. China had endured the Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 45, then the Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 49. You know, with a few little gaps here and there, China was at war for the whole first half of the 20th century. So this is more about context. Now, I think the period you're probably wondering about, or at least in my mind, comes in 48, 49, 50, where I don't think he knows quite what he's going to do next. He does not go to Taiwan. He leaves China and goes to the US. Stays in the US until the mid-50s. And those are the years, or is that kind of what you're probably asking about? This is a period where I think he is not sure what to do next. He's groping for, wondering how everything's going to turn out. He is not hired by Cornell or by Princeton, where he did work in the library for a while briefly. He gets no academic appointment. I think he's kind of at loose ends for a while there. And also he has become less of a central figure. The 20s, 30s, and 40s are his era, especially 20s and 30s. And by the late 40s, he's early 50s, he's really uncertain, I think. Let me toss in one story. I have a body of material that I regard as kind of folklore, which I love, but I didn't put it in the lecture. It all comes from one person. His name is Knight Biggerstaff. He was the modern Chinese historian at Cornell for 35 years. I got his job. So the year that he retired, 1973, was the year I started. And he knew Husher very well personally. And Husher loved to come back to Cornell. Never missed a reunion if he could help it. And I'll mention a story here that I think is relevant to your question. On one occasion, he was at dinner at Knight's house here in Ithaca. It was a summer evening. Now, some of you aren't here in the summers, I guess, but you're probably still familiar with the clouds that roll down Lake Cayuga, the kind that you're racing and you're trying to get indoors before the clouds catch up with you. Apparently, after dinner, one of these storms came up, and gloom overtook the room. And Husher stood up and started reciting exile poetry. It was in this period that we're talking about, the late 40s, early 50s. And he started reciting, especially from Song Dynasty, exile poetry, just highly emotional, and took over the room. The other members of the party, including Knight, really didn't know what to do with it. How to reply to it, and Knight said he thought there was a moment there where silence was going to prevail. Husher finished a long poem, he stopped, there was a silence, lightning struck, there was thunder, and it broke the atmosphere. Everybody relaxed, went back to drinking their coffee and finishing their meal. I think this is a telling story. This is a man who did not systematically take one step after another without emotion. He paid his price in certain periods of his life for the decisions he made. And they weren't always happy ones. And I think that's maybe, in my mind, if you ask about that period, That's what's going on with him. He's got, his emotions are tearing him apart, and he doesn't know where he should be in the world, China or Taiwan or the US or where. He doesn't know where he should be in academic life or what official positions he should assume. I think that must have been a very difficult period of his life. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Cochran. It was a really interesting lecture, and I really appreciate the history. Also, I thought Mr. Kiplinger's comments really helped to focus it. I just wanted to go back to his writing. Do we know the subject of his undergrad essay?
Oh, sorry, I was, well, never mind. I was going to give you one more slide, but we'll do without it. I don't.
Okay.
Does anybody in the room know the subject of his undergraduate essay? No. The account, his winning the prize is well documented. Mm-hmm. I could show you the confirmation of that, but I don't know what he said in that essay.
Was it sponsored by the Arts College, or was it the English department? Was it university-wide?
You know, I'm not sure about that, but I have a vague recollection it had to do with graduation.
Okay.
That as the graduation approached, there was open competition. It did, the little I remember about this, it doesn't remind me of anything that we do right now. I don't think we have an essay. Maybe that's typical of our specialization. We certainly have prizes that we give within departments. My own department.
Knight Prize, I think, in the Writing Institute. There's a
Yes,
Knight
there's
Prize for
that.
undergrad essays.
Maybe that would be the closest thing to it. In history, we give numerous prizes for best thesis of the year and so on, but nothing quite like this. This one, I like the idea that you could come from any discipline to compete for this prize, which was true in his case.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes.
You say the Mao regime had lots to say about it in the 50s. What did he have to say about Mao?
Yes. Well, back in the pre-49 period, he was attacked as early as 1942. 1942 was when the communists were up in the northwest of China, the Yan'an years, as they're usually called, kind of in hiding up there after they'd run from the nationalist troops chasing them during the Long March. And during that period, in 1942, Mao came up with a critique of Western-trained intellectuals. That was the first time that he circulated that critique, and Husserl was on the list, near the top of those criticized. Nonetheless, between then, in the early and mid-40s, Husserl expressed admiration for Mao more than once, and I think he had hopes for some kind of coalition government, which George Marshall from the United States was trying to broker in China at the time. So there are some letters left in which he addressed Mao and spoke of Mao with a certain admiration. Now, the part about the campaign against him, I can't tell you he liked that. I mean, well, you can imagine just this torrent of abusive criticism heaped upon him. He did joke about it. He kept, I guess people sent him copies of the various publications. And he kept a stack in the corner of his office, which grew to large proportions. And he called it his proudest collection because he said it was indicative of what influence he must have had. Maybe what he'd done was worth his while, he said, if it takes that much to try to root it out. That give a suggestion about it, yeah. Yes. Got a microphone? Oh, we're over here, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this wonderful presentation. So, as I mentioned, throughout his life, he's been well known for being a celebrity and being an ambassador and whatever. There are many hats that he's been wearing, but if we go back to his time when he was an undergrad in Cornell University, so how did his study in philosophy influence his future path?
Yes, that's another good question. You forgive me, I can't resist these Knight Biggerstaff stories. I've got one on this. When I arrived on this campus, Knight very kindly showed me around, and part of the tour was of Goldensmith Hall. We went in, I think it was 142, if I remember correctly, and he led me by the hand into the room. He pointed at one seat and he said, "That is where Husserl sat when he changed his major from agriculture to philosophy." And I said to him, it was just the two of us standing there, and I said to him, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because Husserl told me." He led me in here by the hand and pointed to the seat and said that's where he made the decision. This was a big decision for him. And I have given a variation on this lecture before, and I was asked by an ag school grad, why would I assume that Husserl would have been any less influential if he'd stayed in agriculture? Well, this was kind of an unnerving question. I guess I had kind of made that assumption that his major in philosophy launched him into the liberal arts and opened up for him, to be sure, a great variety of subjects. In fact, of all the 20th century Chinese thinkers, I can't think of anybody who's touched on so many subjects. You name it. I mean, not just language, that's what I emphasize today with language reform, but religion and literature, including the big debates over the major novels, and just down the line. So he got into a lot of things, but they don't seem to me now very technical. I think his philosophy major moved him in the direction of the liberal arts and the study of tradition and the critique of studies of tradition, and moved him away from the technical studies where agriculture might have taken him. That'd be, who knows? I mean, this maybe he, as a specialist in agriculture, he would have come up against these same questions, and of language reform and all the rest of it. That was the implication of the question this other person asked me. But I think in this case, the way it turned out, I think philosophy did. And then, remember I mentioned he went from here to Columbia for PhD in philosophy, and with John Dewey, the pragmatist of the time, very influential philosopher. So I hope that. Now, there is more detail about particular professors of philosophy, and I can give you some reference on that if you want to follow up. There were certain ones that influenced him more than others. Are we going by Mike or by me now? I'm not sure.
Could I ask?
Yes.
You have a mic here.
I meant to call on you. Right?
I wanted to ask about. I mean, Husserl was a great iconoclast and leader in the May 4th movement, and wanting to reinvent Chinese culture in certain ways. Very westernized, as we can see from the pictures and so on. And at the same time, but he had this deep identification with Chinese culture and his calligraphy and his acceptance of this traditional marriage or arranged marriage, his reciting of the poetry. I mean, you had some great examples in the lecture. I really liked that. And I'm just wondering, how did his sense of Chinese culture and his sense of Chinese identity evolve over his life? I mean, were there significant changes that you see there? And yeah, I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, good question. I think it gets at one of the deficiencies in the lecture, or not a deficiency exactly, but I chose not to put in anything about his Chinese education in China, which I think is really fundamental. I mean, everybody in this room, especially you undergraduates, know how important your education is before you come to college. And his was, I think, very important to him. I didn't even mention that today. He got basically a classical education. And I think he was very grounded in when he attacked tradition, he knew tradition as one who had been brought up and trained in it. And so he was very, and this is partly the good luck of his, the date of his birth. He was born in 1891. The civil service examination system, under which classical education was encouraged, was abolished in 1905. So he, as a child, was brought up in this classical tradition. Of course, nobody foreseeing that the exam system would be abolished. And he was grounded in that before he then, in 1910, went off to the United States for his education. I think that's very important. I've wondered, too, if I were to say more about his pre-US life, what would be the difference? Is he, as they say, Americanized, or given his fundamental premises and understanding of Chinese scholarship and the rest, how did he change? I don't think he did change his fundamental premises and principles that he grew up with in China. Academically speaking, I do think he changed somewhat emotionally. I think his pre-US years were darker and more pessimistic. This is not an easy time in Chinese history. The 1890s and the early 20th century, full of conflict and proposals for reform, a lot of uncertainty. The last dynasty of imperial China, the Qing dynasty, ended in 1912, just after he had come to the United States. So he grew up with all the turmoil of the first decade of the 20th century. In the US, I think you see a little more positive mood, a little more optimism about prospects for change. That's, if he's Americanized, a word that I prefer not to use, frankly, but if you're looking for what America did to him, I think it gave him a little more optimism about future prospects than he had.
And just a quick follow, if I could, did he identify more with his Chinese roots in a sense later in life? I mean, you know, he had a strong attack on Confucianism, obviously, that you quoted from that wonderful quote. To what extent was that modified as he got older?
Did he become less of an aggressive critic? I don't think so, not as far as I could tell. I mean, he, you know, his style may have changed a little bit, but he was pretty argumentative. And you know, when the People's Republic was founded and he decided not to go back, there was I mean, he took stands. He was forced by default to take stands on a lot of political issues. Just to give you one example, The Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Meng, this is a novel known to most of the people in this room, I should think probably the greatest novel in Chinese history, 18th century novel. He was famous for his position on it, on the interpretation he took. And that actually was the starting point of Mao Zedong's letter about Hu Shi in 1954. He criticized Hu Shi for his mistakes in this interpretation of the novel. A good example of how literature and politics mix in the Chinese context. Well, that was a very vigorous, very aggressive exchange. You know? I mean, Hu Shi didn't give an inch, as far as I can tell, on that point. Where are we? We got Phil and Shushin. You want to go first?
Hello. Sherm, thank you for such an illuminating lecture. I really enjoy so much. You talk about your disagreement with him when it comes to his characterization of Chinese civilization or Chinese culture. That's very interesting. I think, you know, I'm pretty convinced by your lecture he's the greatest Cornellian. And also, I think he's at least one of the greatest intellectuals for his time in China, or greatest Chinese intellectuals in 20th or first part of 20th century. But in terms of particularly his views of Chinese culture against the particular historical period he was living in, what do you think? Particularly against the different historical background we are now living, and in the 21st century, I wonder, can we draw any insight steal from Hu Shi's thinking and thoughts about China, about Chinese culture. I think this particular historical background is what we know now as rise of China. Right? So China is continuously rising, but something seems to be missing in that process or in that transformation. And now people talk about the revival of Chinese tradition or Chinese civilization or Confucianism in particular. But given Hu Shi's particular critical views of Chinese culture, what do you think of, your view? I wonder, what's your view of, the Chinese culture, given Hu Shi's view? What can we learn still from Hu Shi, or can we even further say Hu Shi could be even still great or greatest for the new century? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I'm not sure everybody in the room realizes, I'm not sure I fully realize all the implications of Shushan's question. I think it takes us right to the heart of some current debates in China that are really serious. And I feel a little reluctant to align Hu Shi too fully or clearly with one side or another in these debates. I think one point you're making seems to be similar to some earlier ones about context. We can see him in the context of his times. And it is certainly true that he took on his critics as friends. Two of his best friends were the two co-founders of the Chinese Communist Party, Li Dajiao and Chen Duxiu. These are his best friends. And they're hammering away at each other. Now, when you take his very argumentative approach into the 21st century, and you don't have that personal dynamic between those views and opposing views, it does have a different, it just works differently in the discourse. I think this is the implication of what you're saying. Now, if that's true, then how does it plop down in today's China? Well, the revival of Confucianism, on which incidentally Professor McNeil is one of our leading experts, and I'm certainly not, but on the revival of Confucianism, it does seem to me that revival could prompt, or has prompted some people in China to look to their past for critiques of Confucianism. If Confucianism is back in vogue, then those who are critical of the advocates of this revival look for arguments from the past that might be helpful in the present. I can see him being used that way. If not quoted, then used as a kind of inspiration or uncited source of inspiration. This is very speculative. Now, what is a little bit less speculative, just if I could ground this comment a little more fully, I don't think there's any question but that we have such controversies going on in China now. We have, when people use the words Hu Shi, for example, in response to my name cards, it's no trivial thing. Through his name, very quickly, you get into some serious disputes about democracy and human rights and all sorts of topics that are clearly being debated and taken seriously in China. Someday will there be a democracy in China, a Chinese-style democracy drawing on the work of Hu Shi? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it does seem to me that if that issue is debated fully and without, if it's allowed to be debated fully, he could come into it. That'd be my guess. Largely speculation. Phil.
Okay, yeah, sure. I was just thinking the question.
You got the mic.
The question about why he went from agriculture to philosophy, we might take it back and say, why did he go from philosophy to agriculture? Because that was his grounding in China. And I'm just speculating that we might look for conditions of the Oxford scholarships, or perhaps then as now, many Chinese look to the States with practical knowledge, scientific learning, and it wasn't the automatic thought that you come here and study philosophy at the time. So maybe some dynamic like that.
I think
But
I think you're right.
Philosophy, a short time in agriculture, and back to philosophy to look at the sweep of his life.
Right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I don't think there's any question, but that large number of Chinese coming to Cornell in 1910 were coming for technical training. I mean, that's how, I think that was Cornell's image in China at the time. Agriculture, engineering, something like that. These were the schools for which, the colleges for which Cornell was known. And maybe that was, I don't know if this was a condition of the scholarship, as far as I know, not. But perhaps there was a kind of unspoken or informal requirement that he go into agriculture, which he stayed in for more than a year. His sophomore year, he made the switch. Any other questions? We doing okay, Robin?
We can do maybe one or two more, yeah.
Okay.
Try to make it good then.
Yes.
Professor Cochran, thank you for your talk, and it's great to hear you lecture again. I guess, like one of the previous questioners, I'd like to go back to that bit where you talked about Hu Shi as a celebrity. And you had mentioned his following among women in China and how he had understood their issues. So I guess my question is it too far to say that he was perhaps an early gender activist, or dare I say, an early feminist?
You know, that may not be too strong. I mean, the celebrity category is kind of a soft category. You know, as I said, Hu Shi and Ed Marinero are not thought of, or you're not usually linked. So I don't want to go too far with this. But Margaret Sanger came to China. Margaret, are you familiar with her? Margaret Sanger was probably the leading feminist of the teens in American life, a great advocate of birth control, and very aggressive suffragette before women could vote, had a big reputation. She came to China on a visit, and Hu Shi was her host and translated her lectures. And so, yes, I don't think that's overstating the point. The term feminist, you'd have to put in context, a little different from what you think of today, or what we thought of in America in the 70s. I mean, it's, you know, that term has changed in meaning. But he incidentally was also the host to John Dewey in China, and to other visiting luminaries from the West. He was the one a lot of, not just Americans, but Europeans too, went to as kind of the bridge between where they came from and the China they were visiting. So you got two here. How about up above? Do you have a? I'll remember you. Thanks.
So it seems that Hu Shi actually agreed with the communists on many points, at least on their criticism of old China.
Yes.
So could you please tell us more about how the communists antagonized Hu Shi?
This is really confusing. I agree with you. I know. That's the part that is hard, you know, intellectually speaking, that's the part that's hard to sort out. How could Hu Shi take as a fundamental goal his attack on Confucian tradition, and communist thinkers do the same, and then have them divide so sharply? That is paradoxical, I think, and not easy to sort out. There are many issues on which there were the intellectual issues that can be sorted out. I suppose there are people in this room who can answer that question better than I can. What more can I say about that? I guess one thing, you've had some good questions about context. If you take it back to the, say, late teens, late 1910s, early 1920s, you see people going in many different directions politically with the fundamental agreement on this point about the need for categorically smashing tradition, this kind of iconoclastic attitude. So, for example, I mentioned before the two founders of the Chinese Communist Party, both took this position, the same as Hu Shi did. And they found a lot to argue about. One of the great debates of this period was between Li Dajiao and Hu Shi over the pace of change. And so, yes, attack the Confucian tradition, yes, rid China of it, but how to go about that? And Hu Shi's position was in drips and drabs, bit by bit, using critical thought to figure out what should, how to dismiss or undercut the pillars of the tradition. Whereas Li Dajiao, a Marxist, took the position that the only way to get anywhere soon was by categorical, immediate, a kind of a great leap forward mentality, where you don't go in drips and drabs, you go in big leaps. And this difference in pace of change, I guess, is what I identify as the fundamental difference. Hu Shi just too slow, just too patient, just too willing to rely on critical thought instead of mobilization and campaigning and moving, movements that progress with speed. I think that may be the best I could do on the difference. Maybe similar ultimate goals, but fundamentally different strategies and procedures. Does that help a little bit? Anyway, there's a lot more to that story. That's a big question. Yes, there was one other hand up. Yes, there you are.
Thank you, Professor. So from your point of view, do you think if Hu Shi had made some major mistakes, like those?
Please use the mic because they won't hear you up above.
Okay. So from your point of view, do you think if Hu Shi had made some major mistakes, like either academically or politically, for example, these two extreme attitude towards the traditional Chinese culture, or his relationship with Mao Zedong or Chiang Kai-shek?
Where did he fall short? What were his mistakes, limitations? Well, I did mention as I was going along that I didn't agree with him about tradition. Now, this puts me at odds not just with him, but with just about everybody in May 4th China. All the intellectuals of his era did. Well, I can't be. That's overstating it. Not all the intellectuals, but there was a very strong tendency among Chinese intellectuals of his time, especially in the 20s, to paint tradition in the worst possible terms. Make an assumption that no progress can be made unless tradition is absolutely eliminated, removed. Well, I don't think that's the way it worked out for China. I don't think traditions were fully abolished and here's the place where maybe the distinction between high culture and popular culture should be broken down. It seems to me some of these pronouncements from on high, like the ones Hu Shi made, just didn't work when the ideas were disseminated and diffused. They were not adopted as intellectuals like Hu Shi had proposed they should be. Even the language reform, I didn't get into this in the lecture today, but even the language reform from the classical Chinese to the vernacular didn't play out nearly as effectively as he had assumed it would. And in the 1930s and 40s, some of the literary figures used used a phrase to critique these changes in the language. They just described Baihua, vernacular, as Xin Wenyan, the new classical, because the vernacular itself did not result in mass education and learning for everybody as had been hoped. it had its limitations too, and so language reform then moved into another phase. So I'd say that this is probably his greatest proposal, which certainly had major achievements, but not all the achievements that he had hoped for. I'd say that's a limitation of how he tried to play things out.
So, would you all join me again in thanking